Officer Jake Miller had been with the force for over a decade. Known for his aggressive tactics and deep-seated biases, he had built a reputation for targeting black men in his precinct. His fellow officers either ignored it or quietly approved, brushing off complaints as just another day on the job. He believed he was untouchable, protected by his badge and the silence of his colleagues. One late evening, Jake was patrolling an upscale neighborhood when he noticed a black man standing near a sleek black sedan, dressed in a tailored suit. Something about the man's confidence irritated him. Without a second thought, he pulled over, stepping out with his hand on his baton. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. The man turned to him, his face calm but unreadable. "Just waiting," he replied. Jake didn't like the tone. To him, it sounded like defiance. "Waiting for what?" he snapped. "For you to calm down," the man said simply. Jake saw it as disrespect. Without another word, he shoved the man against the car. "Hands where I can see them." He didn't wait for compliance before grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it behind his back. "That's unnecessary," the man said, his voice steady but firm. Jake wasn't listening. The adrenaline of control rushed through him. He had done this 100 times before. It didn't matter who the man was, he was just another suspect in Jake's eyes. And so, when the man slightly turned his head, Jake saw it as resistance and threw a punch. The blow landed hard. The man stumbled but didn't fall. Blood dripped from his lip as he exhaled, still eerily composed. A patrol car pulled up just then, and 2 officers stepped out. Jake smirked, expecting them to back him up. But when they got close enough to see the man's face, their expressions turned to horror. "Jake," one of them whispered urgently. "What did you do?" Jake frowned. "What does it look like?" This guy was acting suspicious. The other officer swallowed hard. That's Darius Cole." Jake scoffed. "And who the hell is Darius Cole?" The man, now wiping the blood from his mouth, straightened his suit and stared Jake in the eyes. "I'm your new police chief." Silence hung heavy. Jake's stomach dropped. He could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. The weight of his actions, the sheer stupidity of what he had just done, crashed down on him. The officers flanking him stepped back, as if physically distancing themselves from his mistake. One of them immediately reached for his radio, calling for the captain. Jake stood frozen, his mind racing. Darius Cole didn't yell. He didn't lash out. He simply pulled out his badge and held it up to Jake's face. "You're done." The station was in an uproar when they arrived. Jake was processed like any other suspect, photographed, stripped of his badge, and forced to sit in an interrogation room. The irony wasn't lost on him. News of the incident spread fast. The media caught wind, and soon, reporters were camped outside the station. Jake's fellow officers, even those who had once defended him, began to distance themselves. An internal investigation was launched immediately. Darius made it clear he would not allow this to be swept under the rug. For years, men like Jake had operated unchecked. That era ended now. Jake, sitting alone in the holding cell, realized too late that the power he had abused for so long had finally turned against him. Jake sat on the cold metal bench in the holding cell, his mind still struggling to process the rapid downfall of his career. He had always thought himself invincible, protected by the system he had served for years. But now, that same system had turned on him. The station buzzed with activity just outside his cell. Officers he once called friends walked past without even looking at him. Some shook their heads, while others whispered among themselves. He could feel their judgment, their silent relief that they weren't the ones caught in this storm. Hours passed before the door finally opened. Captain Reynolds, his former superior, stepped in with a hardened expression. He tossed a file onto the table in front of Jake. "You've really done it this time," Reynolds muttered, arms crossed. Jake forced a scoff. What, I get a desk job for a couple of months. We both know how this goes. Reynolds shook his head. Not this time. You put your hands on the new police chief, Jake. And not just any chief, Darius Cole. Do you have any idea what kind of man he is? He's got political backing, connections in the mayor's office. He's here to clean house, and you just gave him the perfect excuse to start with you. Jake clenched his jaw. It was a misunderstanding. Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. A misunderstanding? You punched the man in the face. And that's on top of your history, complaints, excessive force reports, all of it. Cole's going to use this to make an example out of you. Jake leaned back, his mind racing. So, what now? I fight it. Reynolds sighed. You could, but you'd lose. And honestly, I don't think anyone will fight for you this time. The department's been under scrutiny for years, and with the media breathing down our necks, Cole has all the leverage. He wants you gone. Jake's hands curled into fists. So, that's it. One mistake, and my career is over. Reynolds gave him a long, tired look. It wasn't just one mistake, Jake. It was a pattern. And now, it's caught up with you. The door opened again, and this time, it was Cole himself who stepped in. He walked with quiet confidence, his presence commanding the room without needing to say a word. He sat down across from Jake, folding his hands on the table. You look nervous, Cole said calmly. Jake forced a smirk. I've been in tougher spots. Cole tilted his head. Have you? Because I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. He leaned forward slightly. You see, I didn't come here just to fire you. I came here to make sure men like you don't get to walk away without consequences. Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. You want me in prison? Cole didn't blink. If it were up to me, you'd be in a cell right now. But I also believe in reform. The question is, can you be reformed, Jake? Jake scoffed. You think I need saving? Cole studied him for a long moment. I think you need a reality check. You spent years abusing your badge, believing the rules didn't apply to you. Now, you're sitting where the people you've arrested have sat. How does it feel? Jake didn't answer. Cole leaned back. You have two options. You can fight this, drag yourself through a legal battle you won't win, and lose everything. Or. He let the word hang in the air. Jake narrowed his eyes. Or what? Cole exhaled. You come clean. Admit your mistakes. Publicly. Own up to what you've done, and maybe, just maybe, there's a path forward for you. One that doesn't end with you behind bars. Jake felt his pride bristle at the idea. Admit he was wrong. In front of the whole world. He had spent his entire career convinced he was the one keeping order. Now, he was being told he was the problem. Cole stood up, giving him one last look. Think about it. But don't take too long. The world is watching. With that, he walked out, leaving Jake alone with the weight of his choices. Jake sat in silence long after Cole had left the room. His mind buzzed, swirling with the implications of what had just been said. The thought of publicly admitting his wrongs seemed almost impossible. His entire career had been built on a foundation of power, control, and a belief that he was above reproach. Publicly acknowledge his mistakes felt like a surrender, like he would lose everything he had ever fought for. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of his situation began to sink in deeper. Jake could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became, this wasn't just about his career. This was about his entire life, the years he had spent believing he was doing the right thing, when in reality, he had been perpetuating a cycle of injustice. The worst part was, deep down, Jake knew it wasn't just that one punch. It wasn't just about Darius Cole. It was about the years of racial profiling, the way he had treated people like them, like suspects, like criminals, just because of the color of their skin. He had ignored every complaint, brushed off every report. He had convinced himself that he was helping, protecting his community, when all he was doing was reinforcing the system of oppression that had existed long before he joined the force. The thought of facing the public, the media, the community, was terrifying. But in that stillness of the holding cell, as Jake replayed the events of that night, he realized he had no choice. If he didn't take responsibility, if he didn't change, the cycle would continue. The system would remain broken. And he would stay stuck in his own delusions. Later that day, Jake was summoned to the station's conference room. The mood was tense as Darius Cole, along with several senior officers, waited for him. The room was filled with the quiet hum of reporters' cameras flashing, capturing every moment. Jake entered, his head low, feeling the eyes of the world on him. Darius stood at the front of the room, his expression neutral but unwavering. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I stand here today not as the man who was assaulted, but as the leader of this department. Our mission has always been to serve and protect, but that mission can only be realized if we hold ourselves accountable." He turned to Jake. "Officer Miller, please step forward." Jake's legs felt like lead as he walked toward the front of the room. The reporters, the officers, and even Darius himself were all watching him. He could feel the weight of their judgment, but this time, he couldn't run from it. He had nowhere to hide. Darius gave him a small nod. "Officer Miller, you've been given a second chance. Not many people get that opportunity. I want you to speak, to own what you've done." Jake swallowed hard. The room was silent as he opened his mouth, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. I'm here today to admit that I've made mistakes. Big mistakes." His voice shook slightly, but he pressed on. "I've failed to see the humanity in the people I swore to protect. I've used my badge as a tool of control, not justice. And I've caused pain, pain that can never be undone." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't expect anyone to forgive me. But I owe it to the people I've hurt to admit the truth. I've been part of a system that has wronged so many, and I'm ashamed of that." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he continued. "I'm not asking for redemption. I'm asking for the chance to learn, to change, and to make things right. I know that will take time, but I'm ready to start that journey today." There was a long silence as Jake finished speaking. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was in control of the situation. He didn't know if the apology was enough, if the damage was too deep, if he could truly change. But he knew one thing: this was the beginning of something new. Darius stood at the front of the room, his expression neutral but unwavering. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I stand here today not as the man who was assaulted, but as the leader of this department. Our mission has always been to serve and protect, but that mission can only be realized if we hold ourselves accountable." He turned to Jake. "Officer Miller, please step forward." Jake's legs felt like lead as he walked toward the front of the room. The reporters, the officers, and even Darius himself were all watching him. He could feel the weight of their judgment, but this time, he couldn't run from it. He had nowhere to hide. Darius gave him a small nod. "Officer Miller, you've been given a second chance. Not many people get that opportunity. I want you to speak, to own what you've done." Jake swallowed hard. The room was silent as he opened his mouth, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. I'm here today to admit that I've made mistakes. Big mistakes." His voice shook slightly, but he pressed on. "I've failed to see the humanity in the people I swore to protect. I've used my badge as a tool of control, not justice. And I've caused pain, pain that can never be undone." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't expect anyone to forgive me. But I owe it to the people I've hurt to admit the truth. I've been part of a system that has wronged so many, and I'm ashamed of that. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he continued. I'm not asking for redemption. I'm asking for the chance to learn, to change, and to make things right. I know that will take time, but I'm ready to start that journey today. There was a long silence as Jake finished speaking. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was in control of the situation. He didn't know if the apology was enough, if the damage was too deep, if he could truly change. But he knew one thing: this was the beginning of something new. Whether it was a path to redemption or a one-way ticket to the end of his career, Jake had to confront the truth, and he had to do it in front of the people who deserved to hear it. Darius looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded once. Thank you, Jake. That's a start. The room was still, the weight of the moment lingering in the air. Jake wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the change he had needed all along. You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. The weeks following Jake's public confession were filled with uncertainty and tension. Despite the apology, many in the department remained skeptical, and the public had mixed reactions. Some believed Jake's words were sincere and appreciated his willingness to face the consequences. Others saw it as too little, too late, just another attempt to save face when it was clear that the damage had already been done. Jake was placed on desk duty while the internal investigation into his actions continued. The days were long and solitary, spent in the corner of a small office with little more than a stack of paperwork to occupy him. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and he often found himself staring out the window, wondering if he could ever truly make amends. Darius Cole, on the other hand, remained an ever-present force in the department. His leadership was firm but fair, and he quickly earned respect from many officers who had initially been hesitant to follow a new chief. His reforms were swift, focusing on improving the relationship between the police and the communities they served. He introduced mandatory anti-bias training for the entire department and worked tirelessly to root out corruption and unethical practices. But despite the progress, there was still a long road ahead. For Darius, this was only the beginning. He knew that changing a culture as entrenched as the one in law enforcement would take time, but he was committed to the work. And, despite the rocky start, he saw potential in Jake. He believed that the officer could redeem himself, not just in the eyes of the public, but in his own heart. One afternoon, several months after the incident, Darius called Jake into his office. It was the first time they had spoken face-to-face since that fateful day. Jake entered hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. Darius motioned for him to sit. "Jake, how are you holding up?" Darius asked, his voice calm but direct. Jake hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I've been better, sir. I know I messed up, and every day, I feel the weight of it. But I'm trying to change. I'm really trying." Darius nodded thoughtfully. "I know you are. And I'm not asking you to be perfect. I just need you to keep doing the work. To keep questioning your actions, your thoughts, your biases. Because you can't fix the system if you're not willing to fix yourself first." Jake swallowed, his throat tight. I'm not sure I'm capable of making up for all the damage I've caused. But I'm willing to try. I have to." Darius leaned forward slightly. "I believe you. But actions speak louder than words. And it's time you showed the department what you're really made of. There's an opportunity, one that might help you start over." Jake raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" "I want you to lead the next community outreach program. You'll be working directly with people from the neighborhoods we've historically had issues with. I think it's important that you get out there, face the people you've hurt, and show them that you're ready to change. But more importantly, you need to show them that you're not the person you were before." Jake's heart raced. "You want me to lead the outreach?" Darius nodded. Yes. You'll be the face of this initiative. It won't be easy. You'll face a lot of resistance, not just from the community, but from your own colleagues. But I think it's the right step for you. You have to rebuild trust, Jake. And that starts with you being vulnerable, being honest, and being out there doing the work. Jake felt a mix of fear and determination. Leading a community outreach program was exactly what he needed, a chance to prove to himself and others that he could be a different person. It wouldn't erase the past, but it could help pave the way for a better future. I'm in, Jake said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. I'll do it. I won't let you down. Darius gave him a small, encouraging smile. I know you won't. But remember, this is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes years of consistent effort. If you're ready for that, then we can move forward. But if not, this might be the hardest thing you've ever done. Jake stood, nodding with resolve. I'm ready. I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm not running anymore. As Jake walked out of Darius's office, he felt a strange sense of hope rising within him. It wasn't the hope of someone who had all the answers, but the quiet optimism of someone who had started down a difficult path, willing to face whatever lay ahead. He had no illusions about the road to redemption. It would be long, filled with setbacks, and at times, painfully slow. But for the first time in a long while, he had the courage to take the first step. The community outreach program launched soon after, and Jake found himself on the front lines. He spent hours in the neighborhoods he had once patrolled with suspicion, listening to the people, hearing their stories, and most importantly, acknowledging the pain he had caused. The resistance was real. Many didn't trust him, and others outright rejected him. But there were also moments of connection, moments when he saw the possibility for change in the eyes of those who had once been his adversaries. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. But with each conversation, each meeting, Jake felt himself slowly becoming the man Darius had believed he could be. The road to redemption was long, and there were no guarantees. But Jake was determined to walk it, no matter how difficult. Because, for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly serve and protect. And it wasn't about power. It was about accountability. It was about justice. And most importantly, it was about change.